They called me the help in my own house, not out loud, never out loud. It was done with gestures, with the careful architecture of small cruelties, with the way my daughter-in-law said my name as though it were a minor inconvenience she had learned to tolerate. 15 years of it, 15 years of becoming smaller and quieter and more invisible inside walls. I had chosen inside rooms. I had painted with my own hands in a house built from the savings of two people who had believed completely and without reservation that what they built together would outlast them both. I want to tell you exactly how it was taken from me, not by strangers, by the son I carried, raised, and loved without condition, and I want to tell you how I took it back piece by piece until there was nothing left for them to hold over me. But to understand how it ended, you need to understand how it began. Not with the lawyers, not with the court dates, not with the mourning. I changed the locks and stood alone in the hallway, listening to the silence of a house that was finally, after 15 years, mine again. It began on an October evening when the air smelled like wet leaves and wood smoke, and I spent 12 hours making someone else's dinner perfect, and I finally understood that nothing was ever going to change unless I made it change myself. My name is Dorothea Price. I am 72 years old, and this is the story of how I stopped disappearing. Harold and I bought the house in 1978. We had almost nothing. We had a down payment scraped together over 4 years of careful living, a shared conviction that this particular house on this particular street was worth every sacrifice we had made to reach it and each other. I was 7 months pregnant with Marshall when we closed. I remember standing in the empty living room with my hand on my stomach, looking at the bare walls and the old hardwood floors, and thinking that I had never felt so rich in my life. I painted every room myself during those last weeks of pregnancy before Marshall arrived. The nursery was yellow because we did not know if we were having a boy or a girl, and yellow felt like hope. The kitchen was a warm cream that Harold said made him hungry every time he walked through the door. The bedroom we shared was a deep blue-gray that looked different in every light, silver in the morning, almost navy at night, and I loved it precisely because it refused to be just one thing. Harold built the bookshelf in his study by hand. He was not a natural carpenter, and it showed slightly a lean to the left that we never corrected because we came to think of it as the shelf's personality. He spent a weekend on it cursing quietly and apologizing to me for the cursing, and when it was done, he stood back and looked at it with an expression I recognized as the same one he wore when Marshall took his first steps. Pride that comes from making something from nothing. 30 years we lived in that house. 30 years of ordinary mornings and difficult evenings, and the slow accumulating intimacy of two people who chose each other over and over without ever making a formal announcement of it. Harold worked his way up at Whitmore Industries over 35 years, from junior analyst to senior partner, and the company rewarded his loyalty with shares that grew quietly in value while we went on living modestly, driving old cars, buying suits on sale, saving for Marshall's education and for whatever came after. We talked about the shares sometimes in the evenings, the way you talk about money when you are not afraid of it, but you respect it. Harold would say that they were our security, our foundation, the thing that meant we would never have to worry. He said Marshall would inherit what remained after we were gone, and that felt right to us, felt like the natural order of a life built carefully and with intention. Harold died in February 9 years ago, a heart attack, sudden and complete, the kind that does not negotiate. One morning he was there, and by afternoon he was not, and the world divided permanently into before and after, and I spent the months that followed in a fog so thick I could barely find my way through it. Marshall was there immediately. He was capable and organized, and he took charge of everything with a brisk competence that I mistook for devotion. The lawyers spoke to him, not to me. The bank accounts were restructured with Marshall's name added for convenience, so that he could manage things while I was not in a condition to manage anything. Papers were placed in front of me, and I signed them because I was drowning in grief, and everyone around me kept saying not to worry, that everything was being handled, that I just needed to focus on healing. I trusted him. He was my son. I found out much later what those papers actually said, but that comes later. First, let me take you to October. The invitation list for Serena's charity board dinner had been on the refrigerator for 2 weeks. 12 women from the hospital foundation, the kind of women who wore their wealth like a second skin, who could identify the vintage of a wine at 20 paces, and whose opinions about floral arrangements could make a caterer weep. Serena chaired the foundation's capital campaign that year. The dinner was, in her words, critically important. I had been up since 5 in the morning. I had polished the silver. I had ironed the linen napkins with a crease so precise it would have satisfied a military inspector. I had arranged flowers from the garden in the crystal vases that Harold's mother had given us as a wedding gift. I had prepared a salmon en croûte because the market had been out of beef tenderloin, a substitution I had made based on 30 years of cooking experience that told me the salmon was actually the superior dish. Serena came downstairs at 8 in the morning and stood at the kitchen doorway in her silk robe, looking at the salmon preparation laid out on the counter, and her expression shifted in the way it always shifted when I had done something without being given explicit permission to do it. I said beef Wellington, she said. The market was out. The salmon is better for this group anyway. It's lighter, it won't sit heavy before. I didn't ask for your opinion about what sits heavy, she said. Is that genuinely too much to expect? I looked at her. I looked at the salmon I had been preparing since 6 in the morning. I thought about the drive I had made to 3 different markets looking for the right cut of beef before finally accepting that it was not to be found that day. Of course, I said instead, I'll make it work. She had already turned away. And Dorothea tonight, when the guests arrive, just serve the first course and then stay in the kitchen. I'll handle the rest of the evening. The rest of the evening. She meant she would handle being seen. She meant I was presentable enough to carry soup, but not presentable enough to remain in the room while people ate it. Some of these women are very particular, she added, as though this explained everything, as though it were not an explanation at all, but an erasure. I said nothing. I had been saying nothing for 15 years, and I was very practiced at it. At 9:30 a car pulled up the driveway, and Serena crossed the foyer quickly. I heard the front door open, heard the exchange of greetings that women who are performing friendship make for each other, and then Serena brought her guest into the kitchen. Cecilia Voss was 60 years old, expensively maintained, and possessed of the specific confidence that comes from having spent decades being the most important person in any room she entered. She chaired the Hospital Foundation's board, and she and Serena had been close for as long as I had been in this house, watching their friendship bloom in rooms I was never invited to enter. She looked at me the way you look at a piece of furniture you are not sure you remember ordering. "Serena," she said without lowering her voice, "is this your new housekeeper?" The pause before Serena answered was exactly long enough to confirm everything. "That's Dorothea," Serena said, "my mother-in-law. She helps around the house." Cecilia gave me a smile that involved only the bottom half of her face. "How nice," she said, and turned back to Serena, and that was the entirety of it. That was the whole interaction. I was categorized and dismissed in the time it takes to draw a breath. I went back to the salmon. My hands kept moving, because that is what hands do when the mind has gone somewhere quiet and cold and very still. By 7 in the evening, the house was full and bright and loud with the laughter of women who had no idea I existed. I could hear it from the kitchen, that particular music of people performing their own happiness for each other, and underneath it, Marshall's voice, warm and charming, playing the role of generous host with practiced ease. I had spent 12 hours making the stage for this performance. Neither of them had thought to mention that to anyone. I loaded the first course onto the serving cart at 7:30. The Limoges soup bowls, the ones that had been my mother's, were arranged in a careful arc. They were the only things I owned that Serena had not managed to absorb into her version of the house. I had kept them in the back of the highest cabinet in the kitchen, where they were too inconvenient to become someone else's aesthetic choice. Or so I had believed. Looking at them now arranged on the serving cart, I understood that at some point Serena had found them and decided they were exactly the right level of old money, understated for a charity board dinner. She had not asked. She had simply taken them the way she had taken everything else, smoothly and without acknowledgement, as though ownership were a technicality she had long since stopped observing. I pushed the cart down the back hallway and through the service entrance in my own house. The dining room was beautiful, I will say that. The candlelight fell across the mahogany table that Harold and I had found at an estate sale in Connecticut 3 decades ago, the one we had driven 4 hours to look at, and 4 hours home after buying it, laughing for most of the return trip at the impracticality of transporting a table in a station wagon. The crystal caught the light and threw small prisms across the walls. The roses I had arranged that morning still held their shape perfectly. Serena sat at the head of the table, my seat once. She looked radiant in a way that took considerable effort and looked entirely effortless, and she was telling a story that had the whole table leaning slightly forward with attention, and I moved around the edges of the room with the soup bowls invisible as smoke. No one looked at me. No one said thank you. A woman with white hair and diamonds on every available surface was asking Serena how long they had lived in the house. 15 years, Serena said smoothly. Marshall inherited it from his father. Inherited. The word entered me somewhere below the ribs and stayed there. Harold and I scraped together the down payment over 4 years. We refinanced twice to put Marshall through school. I painted every room in this house while carrying that boy in my body. I planted the garden. I chose the doorknobs and the light fixtures and the wallpaper in the dining room where these women were now sitting. Harold built the bookshelf in his study himself, and it still leaned slightly to the left, and it was still there, and Marshall had not touched it because Marshall had not built it and did not understand what it meant. This was not an inheritance. This was our life, and she had just described it as a transfer of property. I kept moving. I kept my face arranged in the expression of polite neutrality that 15 years had made automatic. I was carrying the last bowl to the far end of the table when Cecilia Voss, without looking up from her conversation, raised 2 fingers in the small imperious gesture people use to summon servers in restaurants. The Chateau Neuf du Pape, she said to the air to my left, as though addressing the room rather than a person. Then she turned and looked at me, and something flickered in her eyes that was not unkindness exactly, but was the absence of kindness, the specific blankness of someone who has never had to consider whether the people serving their food have interior lives. The 2009 deer, not the 12 deer. Marshall was sitting 8 feet away. He heard it. I know he heard it because I watched the back of his neck for a reaction, and there was none. He was cutting his meat and discussing something with the woman beside him, and the moment did not exist for him in any way that required a response. Of course, I said. I went back to the kitchen. I set the wine glasses down. I stood at the sink with the water running and looked out the window at the garden I had planted and tended and lost track of in recent years because I no longer had the time, because there was always something else that needed to be done for them, always some task that took precedence over the things that had once made me feel like myself. My mother's Limoges soup bowl sat on the edge of the counter where I had set it down too hard. The sound when it cracked was small, a clean sound, precise like a sentence ending. I looked at it for a long time. For 15 years, I had told myself it was temporary. I had told myself that Marshall would remember who I was, that the grief of losing his father had changed him, and that some version of the boy who used to bring me wild flowers from the backyard would eventually reassemble itself from whatever he had become. I had told myself that Serena would soften, that time would blunt the edges of her contempt, that I would find my footing in this house that had ceased to be my house and become something I was permitted to occupy on sufferance. Standing there with the broken bowl, I finally stopped telling myself those things. This was not temporary. This was not grief. This was a choice they had made and continued to make every single day, and it was going to go on exactly as it was until the end of whatever time I had left, unless something changed. Something needed to change. I served the rest of the dinner. I served the main course, the salmon en croûte, that I had spent the morning preparing, and no one commented on it, and Serena accepted the compliments about the menu with a gracious smile that suggested she had planned it herself. I served dessert. I was not invited to join them for coffee. I cleaned the kitchen. I cleaned the dining room, the wine stains and the lipstick smudged glasses and the crumbs ground into the antique rug that Harold and I had bought at the same estate sale as the table, a matching set, a single day of impractical joy that had always made me smile to remember. By midnight, I was climbing the stairs to the third floor with legs that felt like they were made of concrete. I passed the second floor landing and saw the light under Marshall and Serena's door. I heard Serena laugh low and satisfied, the laugh of someone who has gotten exactly what she wanted. I kept climbing. I lay in my small room under the slanted ceiling and listened to the radiator and thought about Harold. I had been a good man, a careful man, a man who planned things and took his responsibilities seriously. He would not have left me with nothing. He would not have done that. We had talked about our estate planning, the way we talked about everything important seriously and at length, and I knew what he had intended because he had told me more than once, in the straightforward way he had of speaking about things that mattered. I had intended to take care of me, so why in the years since his death had nothing felt like being taken care of? The lawyers had been vague when I tried to ask questions. Marshall had always intervened before I could press for specifics. Just focus on healing Mom, he said. I will handle everything. And I had let him because I was 63 years old and exhausted and broken open with grief, and because he was my son and I trusted him the way you trust the people who are supposed to be on your side. But lying there in that small cold room, listening to the radiator clank and the house settle around me, I felt something that had been asleep for a very long time begin to wake up. Not the hot, explosive anger I had swallowed and suppressed for 15 years. Something else, something cold and quiet and precise. The kind of clarity that comes when you have been looking at something wrong for a long time and the angle suddenly shifts and you see it as it actually is. I had been played for 15 years, maybe longer, and I did not yet know how deep it went, but I was going to find out. The next morning, Serena found a coffee stain by the espresso machine that I was fairly certain did not exist. I had cleaned the kitchen until it was spotless the night before, the way I always did, the way I had done 1,000 times, without acknowledgement or thanks. I looked at the place she was pointing, and I did not see a stain. I'll take care of it, I said, but the automatic apology did not come. I felt it waiting at the back of my throat, and I let it wait there. She looked at me for a moment with something new in her expression, a small uncertainty, a hairline fracture in the absolute confidence with which she had always addressed me. The almond milk is gone, she said. I know. Another pause. You know I need it for my smoothie. The organic brand you use is not available at the convenience store. The regular market does not open until noon. The corner of her mouth pressed into a thin line. She picked up her bag and her car keys, and she left for her tennis lesson without another word, and I stood in the kitchen listening to her car back out of the driveway and felt the silence close around me like something I had been holding my breath for. 2 days later, on a Tuesday afternoon, I was folding laundry in the third-floor hallway. Serena's silk blouses, each one requiring particular handling that the dry cleaner apparently could not be trusted to provide. Marshall's dress shirts, expensive and exacting. My hands moved through the familiar routine, and my mind was somewhere else entirely. My phone rang, an unfamiliar number. I almost did not answer, but something made me pick up, some instinct I could not have named if you had asked me. Mrs. Price, a man's voice, professional measured. Dorothea Price. Yes, this is Owen Bassett from Whitmore and Associates. I have been attempting to reach you for several weeks, but the number we had on file appears to have been disconnected. I knew immediately why that was. Marshall had switched me to a cheaper phone plan the previous year. He had said it would save money. He had handled the transition himself, and my new number had not found its way back to many people. I apologize for the difficulty in reaching you, Owen Bassett said. I am calling regarding your husband's estate, specifically his holdings in Whitmore Industries. There have been some significant developments in the probate process, and I believe you and I need to speak in person. The folded shirt in my hands went still. My son handles all of that, I said carefully. Marshall Price, he manages the estate. A pause, not a confused pause, a careful one. Mrs. Price, Owen Bassett said, I think it is important that we meet privately. Would you be available tomorrow afternoon? And I would ask that you not mention this call to anyone before we speak. Why? I asked. Another pause, this one longer. Let's just say there are some irregularities in how your late husband's estate has been managed. Irregularities I believe you should understand fully before discussing them with your son. I sat down on the floor of the hallway, right there among the laundry, without planning to. The pile of carefully folded shirts slid sideways, and I did not try to stop them. What kind of irregularities? My voice came out steadier than I felt. I would prefer to explain in person. Tomorrow at 2 o'clock I can text you the address. Yes, I said, I'll be there. He gave me the address and ended the call, and I sat on the floor of the third-floor hallway of my own house, surrounded by other people's clothing, and listened to my heart beating in my ears and thought about a single word: irregularities. I did not sleep that night. I lay in the dark and let my mind move carefully through the years of things I had accepted without questioning the speed with which everything had been reorganized after Harold died, the vagueness of the lawyers when I had tried to ask about specifics, Marshall's patient and repeated reassurances that there was nothing for me to worry about. I had taken those reassurances at face value because I was drowning and he was my son, and it had been easier to be held up than to try to swim on my own. But what if the reassurances had not been comfort? What if they had been management? At 2 in the morning, I made a decision. I went downstairs. Harold's study was Marshall's office now. He kept it locked, but the key had always lived in the same place, taped under the lip of the desk's center drawer, because Harold had kept it there, and Marshall had apparently never found a reason to change what Harold had established. I knew about the key because Harold had shown me years ago in that easy way he had of sharing the small, practical details of his life with me, as though there were no part of it he thought I should not know. The filing cabinet, Marshall's neat handwriting on each folder tab, Whitmore Industries quarterly reports, Whitmore Industries board minutes, Whitmore Industries stock certificates. I opened the stock certificate folder. The first certificate was for 50,000 shares, Marshall Price's name printed clearly in the space where the owner's name belonged. The date of transfer 4 months after Harold died. I turned to the next page. Marshall Price, another transfer 6 months after the first, and the next, and the next. Page after page after page, all of them bearing Marshall's name, all of them dated within the first 2 years after Harold's death, all of them representing pieces of the company Harold had spent his life building a stake in. I went through the entire folder. I turned every page. I looked for my name in every document. It was not there. I was sitting in Marshall's desk chair with the folder in my hands when I heard him. "What are you doing?" Ha was in the doorway, backlit by the hall light. His voice was not sleepy. It was cold in the specific way of someone who has been awake and listening. "I couldn't sleep," I said. "I was looking. Those are my files. They were your father's files." I stood up, papers scattering across the floor between us. "Marshall, I got a phone call today. A lawyer. He said there were irregularities in how your father's estate was handled." Something moved across his face. It was too brief to identify clearly, but it was not nothing. "What lawyer?" "Owen Bassett from Whitmore and Associates." A longer pause. "What did he want?" "He wants to meet with me. Tomorrow. He said there are irregularities." I gestured at the papers on the floor. "Marshall, your name is on all of these. Every single certificate. There is nothing here with my name on it. Your father owned a significant stake in that company. Where is my name?" "There are no documents with your name on them," he said, with a directness that stopped my breath. "Dad left his shares to me, to keep the company in family hands. He knew I would take care of you. Harold left me nothing." He did not flinch. "The trust has provisions for your care. That's why you're here. That's why Serena and I have been supporting you." I looked at my son. I looked at the stranger wearing my son's face in the room that used to belong to my husband. "I have a meeting tomorrow at 2, I said quietly. "Cancel it." "No." He studied me for a moment, reassessing something. Then he said, "These people prey on grieving women, Mom. They tell you what you want to hear, and then they take whatever's left of your savings. I'm trying to protect you." "Then come with me," I said. "If you have nothing to worry about, come to the meeting. Help me understand what's going on." A long silence. "I have a conference call at 2, he said finally. "Then I'll go alone." He stared at me across the scattered papers, across 15 years of deference and silence and swallowed questions, and something shifted between us that I did not think would ever fully shift back. "Fine," he said. "Go, but don't come to me when they try to take what little you have left." I walked out and I stood alone in Harold's study among the stock certificates that bore my son's name and not mine, and I thought, what have you done? I did not go back to bed. I sat in that room until the light changed and the house began its early morning sounds. Serena's alarm, the shower, her footsteps heading for the kitchen, and the smoothie I was supposed to have almond milk ready for. I heard her call my name and I did not move. Let her get her own almond milk. The thought arrived fully formed and startling. I had not chosen it. It had simply come like something that had been waiting a long time for permission. I sat with it for a moment. Then I went upstairs to my small room and I stood in front of the mirror and I looked at myself. Gray hair escaping its bun, lines carved deep around my mouth, dark circles under my eyes that had been there so long I had stopped seeing them. I looked tired, I looked old, but there was something in my eyes that had not been there yesterday, something that had surfaced overnight from wherever it had been buried, and I recognized it the way you recognize a face from a long ago photograph. That was me, still there, after everything. I took out my good dress, the navy one I had bought 5 years ago for a funeral, and never worn again. I put on the pearl earrings that had been my mother's, the ones Serena had somehow never borrowed. In the mirror, I looked like someone who was going somewhere that mattered, someone who deserved answers, someone who was not, despite 15 years of evidence to the contrary, just the help. I left through the front door, not the service entrance. The front door. The October air was cold and clean and smelled like the beginning of something. The law offices of Whitmore and Associates occupied the third floor of a building that had been old when the century was young. Marble floors, brass fixtures, dark wood paneling that absorbed sound and light in equal measure. The kind of building that did not need to announce its authority because its authority had been established before anyone currently alive was born to question it. I felt out of place the moment I walked through the doors, not because I did not belong there, because 15 years of being made to feel like a guest in my own home had done something to my sense of where I was permitted to stand without apology. The receptionist typed my name into her computer, and her expression changed, just slightly. The way expressions change when a name means something the face had not been prepared to encounter. "Of course, Mrs. Price, he's expecting you. Third floor, suite 312. Owen Bassett stood when I entered his office. He was 55 perhaps, with steel gray hair and the measured handshake of a man who had delivered difficult news so many times that he had learned to lead with steadiness rather than warmth. His eyes were kind. I had stopped trusting kind eyes, but I noted them anyway. He opened a file folder on his desk and looked at it for a long moment before he looked at me. "Mrs. Price," he said, "what I'm about to tell you is going to be difficult to hear, and I want to say, before I begin, that I am sorry it took this long to reach you." I sat with my hands in my lap and said nothing. I had learned that silence was sometimes the most effective way to make room for a truth that would otherwise be talked around. "Your husband owned 150,000 shares in Whitmore Industries at the time of his death," Owen said. He slid a document across the desk. "This is his final stock certificate dated 2 weeks before he died, the number at the bottom." I looked at the document. The numbers required a moment to resolve themselves into meaning. 150,000 shares, I said. At current market value, those shares are worth approximately $42 million. The room did not spin. I want to be clear about that because I think people expect a revelation of that magnitude to be accompanied by some physical drama. What actually happened was that everything became very still. The sounds of the building dropped away. I looked at Owen Bassett across his mahogany desk, and I felt the numbers settle into me with a weight that would take time to fully register. $42 million. Harold had built that over 35 years, one careful decision at a time, driving a 10-year-old car and buying his suits on sale and investing everything he could in the company he believed in. He had built it for us, for our future, for the security he wanted me to have when he was gone. And I had been living in the attic room of my own house, washing someone else's silk blouses by hand, being sent through the service entrance. "Mrs. Price," Owen's voice was careful, "are you all right?" "Tell me the rest," I said. I explained the trust structure that Harold had established. Harold's will had specified a clear division, 70% of his estate to me, 30% to Marshall, with the understanding that Marshall would eventually inherit my portion after my death. It was generous to Marshall. It was also unambiguous about my right to the majority while I was living. Shortly after Harold died, someone had filed amended trust documents with the probate court. The amendments changed everything. Under the revised terms, I was designated to receive a monthly stipend of $1,500. Marshall received full control of all assets, including the entire stock portfolio. $1,500 a month. I had never seen a single payment. Who filed the amendments? I asked, though some part of me already knew. Your son, Marshall Price. Owen paused. He claimed you had consented to the changes due to concerns about your ability to manage such a large estate at your age. I had not consented. I had never seen those documents. I had been drowning in grief and signing papers placed in front of me without reading them because I was 63 years old and my husband of 40 years had died, and Marshall kept saying everything was being handled. Owen slid another document across the desk. This is the signature on the amended trust documents. I looked at it. The signature was almost mine. The loops were wrong. The angle of the letters was slightly off. Practice, but not perfected. The work of someone who had studied my handwriting carefully, but had not quite absorbed the small unconscious particularities that make a signature impossible to replicate exactly. That is not my signature, I said. No, Owen said. I didn't think it was. He set the document aside. Mrs. Price, I need to be direct with you. What I believe happened is that your son committed fraud. He forged your signature on legal documents, filed them with a court that was backlogged and understaffed, and did not scrutinize them closely enough, and has been operating as the sole controller of your estate for the past 9 years. He has been using shares that legally belong to you to vote on corporate matters and collect dividends. The word fraud sat between us on the desk like a physical object. My Marshall, the boy who used to fall asleep watching baseball in my lap, the boy who cried in my arms for an hour the first time a girl broke his heart, the boy I had been so certain would grow up to be good. What happens now? I asked. My voice was steady. I was surprised by how steady it was. That depends entirely on you, Owen said. We can file a motion to invalidate the amended documents. We can demand a full accounting of all estate assets. We can pursue criminal charges if you choose to. He paused. But Mrs. Price, I want you to understand what that means. Your son will fight. He has resources. This will take time, and it will almost certainly become public. I want my money back, I said, all of it, and I want the house. He looked at me with an expression I could not quite categorize. The house, Harold and I bought it in 1978. It should have transferred to me automatically when he died. Somehow it ended up in a trust that Marshall controls. I met his eyes. I want it back. Owen Bassett smiled for the first time. It was a slow smile, the kind that means something. Mrs. Price, he said, I think we are going to work very well together. I took the subway home. I sat by the window and watched the city move past in the late afternoon light and thought about Harold, not about the money, not about what had been taken, about Harold himself, about the 35 years he had gone to that office and done the work and made the decisions that had quietly, steadily built something real. He had done it for us. That had been the whole point of it, the entire reason, and Marshall had understood that well enough to wait until his father was barely cold before dismantling it. The ring on my left hand caught the light from the window. Harold had saved for 6 months to buy it. We had been broke students when he proposed standing on a beach in Maine in September with the wind pulling at my coat and his hands shaking slightly as he held out the small box. I had said yes before he finished asking the question. I had trusted that I would be taken care of. I came home through the front door and heard voices in the living room before I reached it. Marshall's voice and Serena's low and tight with stress. I moved without thinking to the edge of the hallway where the shadow was deep enough to conceal me. She's not going to do anything, Serena was saying. She's a 72-year-old woman with no money and no options. What exactly is she going to do? She already did it, Marshall said. Bassett called my office this afternoon. He's representing her. A brief silence. Then Serena laughed, but it was not her practiced social laugh. This one had a ragged edge to it. You're joking. Do I sound like I'm joking? Marshall, relax. So she found some ambulance chaser to file a motion. It'll be dismissed. Bassett is a senior partner at Whitmore and Associates. Marshall's voice was quieter now, more controlled, which somehow made it more frightening. They don't take cases they don't think they can win. Another silence longer. When Serena spoke again, her voice had changed. What can he actually prove? I don't know yet. That's what concerns me. Did you cover your tracks? A pause. I thought so, but if they start pulling records comparing the signatures, he stopped. You told me you handled the signatures, Serena said. You told me it was clean. Quiet, Marshall said sharply. I pressed myself against the wall. My heart was beating so hard I was certain they would hear it. We need to offer her something, Serena said. A settlement, whatever it takes to make this go away quietly. With what everything is tied up, if I start moving shares, people will ask questions. Then offer her the house. Let her have it free and clear. She already owns the house, Marshall said. Or she should. That's probably what Bassett is arguing. A beat of silence. Then Serena said something that made the blood slow in my veins. There's another option. Marshall was quiet. We have her evaluated, Serena said. Petition for a competency hearing. If we can get the right doctor to sign off, a judge will appoint you as her legal guardian. You maintain control of everything. She cannot sign contracts, cannot direct litigation, cannot do any of this. A long pause. Can we actually make that case? She's 72. She lives alone. She's been isolated for years. Marshall, she went through your private files in the middle of the night. That's not rational behavior. She might be sharp enough to make it difficult. Then we find someone who knows how to make a sharp person look confused, Serena said. It's done all the time. I had heard enough. I walked back to the front door, opened it, and closed it again with a deliberate sound. I'm home, I called, and my voice only shook a little. Marshall appeared in the hallway wearing the face of someone performing normalcy. Mom, how was your afternoon? I looked at him, at the man who had stood in his father's study 8 hours ago and told me with complete calm that my name was not on any of the documents because his father had left everything to him, at the man who had just on the other side of a wall discussed finding a doctor willing to testify that I was incompetent. Fine, I said, just fine. Dinner was tense in the way of a room full of things that cannot be said. Serena had ordered Thai food, which she knew I did not like, and they ate at the formal dining room table while I poured wine. I would not be invited to sit down and drink, and the three of us performed the familiar choreography of a family that had long since stopped being one. Marshall waited until I was refilling his glass. "So, Mom, this lawyer you saw today." My hand did not shake. I was proud of that. "I explained some things about your father's estate," I said. "What kinds of things?" I set the wine bottle down and looked directly at my son. "That I am supposed to hold a 70% interest in Whitmore Industries, that your father established a trust with very clear terms, and that someone filed amended documents after his death that changed those terms without my knowledge or consent." Marshall's expression did not move. "Is that what he told you?" "That is what the documents show," he sighed, setting down his fork with the patience of a man explaining something obvious to someone slow. "Mom, these lawyers, they see a widow and they construct a story designed to upset her. Dad's estate was settled properly years ago according to his wishes, with my forged signature." The word landed in the room and did not dissipate. Marshall stood up. "You need rest. You're not thinking clearly." For the first time in 15 years, I said, "I am thinking with complete clarity." What followed was the kind of conversation that cannot be walked back from. I said things I had been swallowing for 15 years, and they came out in a voice I barely recognized, steady and cold and precise. I told him what had been taken. I told him what it had cost me to live in this house as something less than its owner, less than a person who mattered, less than the woman his father had built his life beside. Marshall's face went through several things: anger and defensiveness, and something that looked briefly like guilt before it hardened back into anger. "That money was mine," he said. "Dad built that company, and I am the one who has been managing his legacy by waiting for me to die." The room went very quiet. He grabbed his car keys. "We're leaving. But understand something, Mom. You will not win this. I have lawyers and documentation and everything I need to show that you consented to every arrangement. You will spend whatever you have left fighting a battle you cannot win." "Then why are you afraid?" I said. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he and Serena took their bags and walked out, and the front door closed, and I stood in the dining room alone for the first time in 15 years. The tears came eventually. A long time coming, 15 years of them, and they were not quiet or dignified. I let them go because there was no one left to perform composure for. When they finally stopped, I felt hollowed out and clean and very, very awake. I did not sleep that night either. I moved through the house in the dark, not with grief, but with intention, touching things as I went to confirm they were still real, still mine. The kitchen table where Marshall had done his homework for 18 years, the living room where we had opened Christmas presents in a sprawl of wrapping paper and laughter, the study where Harold and I had talked about our future in the easy, unguarded way of two people who had no secrets from each other. At 3 in the morning, I went into the master bedroom. It smelled like Serena's perfume. Her clothes covered every surface. Her shoes lined the closet. Her bottles covered the dresser that Harold and I had bought at the same Connecticut estate sale as the table. I began pulling things off the hangers, slowly at first, then faster, filling my arms and dropping everything into the hallway. Dress after dress, suit after suit, the careful, expensive wardrobe of a woman who had spent 15 years dressing in the master bedroom of someone else's house without ever acknowledging whose house it was. By dawn, I had cleared both their rooms. Everything was piled at the front door. I called a locksmith at 7 in the morning. By 9 o'clock, every lock in the house had been changed. Owen Bassett called at 9:15. Mrs. Price, I just received a rather angry call from your son's attorney. I asked them to leave last night, and this morning I changed the locks. A pause. You've escalated the situation significantly. Good, I said. I'm finished with quiet. I heard something in the silence that might have been a lawyer suppressing something unprofessional. They will attempt to regain access through the courts. It will take time, but they will try. In the meantime, document everything. Photograph the house as it stands right now. And Mrs. Price, if they come back in person, do not be alone. I don't have anyone, I said. The words came out before I could decide whether to say them, and the truth of them hit me in a way that the $42 million had not. 15 years of isolation had accomplished exactly what it was designed to accomplish. I had no one to call. Then call me, Owen said. Day or night, you are not alone in this. But I was, and we both knew it. They came back that afternoon, Marshall's face dark with the fury that had clearly been building for hours, Serena's eyes red, and her mascara wrecked the two of them, standing on the porch of my house, surrounded by the suitcases I had left outside. I opened the window, not the door. Mom, this is insane. Open the door. It is not your house, I said. We have rights here. We have legal standing. Then establish it in court. Marshall's voice dropped to something dangerous and quiet. You are making the worst mistake of your life. The worst mistake of my life was trusting you with your father's estate, I said. Everything since then has just been the consequence of that mistake. I closed the window. I watched through the glass as they loaded their bags into the car and drove away, and I stood in my house, and for the first time since Harold died, I took a breath that went all the way to the bottom of my lungs. The competency petition arrived by courier on the third morning. I stood in the front hallway and read it through twice. The language was clinical and impersonal, and in several places genuinely chilling. Subject demonstrates difficulty managing household tasks without supervision. Subject exhibits paranoid ideation regarding family members. Subject has demonstrated poor judgment, evidenced by retaining legal counsel based on unverified allegations. Every line was a distortion of something real. My difficulty managing the household tasks had come from doing all of them alone while they lived like guests at a resort. My isolation had been deliberately engineered, Marshall routing my calls and telling my friends I was not up for visitors until they stopped trying. My supposed paranoid ideation was the accurate conclusion I had reached after sitting on the floor of my husband's study, surrounded by stock certificates bearing my son's name instead of mine, turned inside out like this, presented in clean procedural language. It sounded like a portrait of a confused old woman unraveling at the edges. I called Owen. They're trying to have me declared incompetent, I said. Yes. Marshall's legal team filed an emergency petition yesterday afternoon. They've requested a hearing before Judge Raymond Holt. A pause that carried weight. Holt has a reputation in family court for taking the adult child's side in disputes with elderly parents. He tends to interpret protective intervention charitably. And they win, not if we are prepared. I'm scheduling you for an independent psychological evaluation today, if at all possible. The hearing is in 5 days. 5 days to prove I was not losing my mind. 5 days before a judge who was already inclined to believe I was. There's something else, Owen said. I received a call this morning from a woman named Cecilia Voss. The name landed with a cold precision. She said she will testify at the hearing, Owen continued. She intends to provide observations about your behavior at social events over the past several years. Confusion, forgetfulness, apparent disorientation. I sat down at the kitchen table. Cecilia Voss, who had called me dear in my own dining room, while my son sat 8 feet away and said nothing. Serena had been thorough. I would give her that. Dr. Constance Morrow's office was in Cambridge, on a street lined with elm trees that had started to turn. She was 60 years old with direct eyes and the manner of someone who had spent decades listening to people tell her the things they were most afraid to say out loud. She sat across from me with a notepad and asked questions that felt designed to reveal something, and I answered them as carefully as I had answered anything in my life. She gave me lists of words to remember and asked me to repeat them 20 minutes later. She showed me photographs and asked me to identify what I saw. She asked me to count backward from 100 by sevens, and I did it without hesitating. She asked me what I had watched on television the previous evening. I described a documentary about the Romanov family in more detail than she appeared to expect. You have a very strong memory, Mrs. Price. Is that unusual? For your age, for anyone? What you've demonstrated today is functioning at a high cognitive level. She set down her pen. Can I ask you something off the record? I said yes. Why do you think your son filed this petition? Because I am suing him for my inheritance, and he believes that having me declared incompetent is the most efficient way to stop me. She looked at me for a long moment. I think you've been living in a psychologically abusive environment for a significant period of time. I think you've been systematically conditioned to doubt your own perceptions and minimize your own needs. And I think your son is counting on that conditioning to make you appear unstable in front of a judge. But I'm not unstable. No, she said. You're not. You're traumatized. That's a meaningful distinction, and my evaluation is going to make it clearly. She leaned forward slightly. But Mrs. Price, competence isn't only a question of what the tests show. It's a question of whether you have the psychological strength to stand in front of a hostile judge with your son's lawyers working against you and hold your ground. Can you do that? I thought about the filing cabinet in Harold's study, about the papers scattered across the floor, about the word no, the first one I had said to Marshall in 15 years, and how it had come out of me steadier than I expected. Yes, I said, I can. The morning of the hearing arrived gray and cold. Owen met me at the courthouse entrance with the calm of a man who had prepared for this, who had anticipated every argument they would make and built a structure that could bear the weight of it. Remember, he said, as we walked through security, you are the person in that room who knows the truth. Don't let them make you forget that. The courtroom was smaller than I had imagined. Wood paneling, fluorescent lights, the kind of institutional quiet that makes every sound feel significant. Marshall was already at the plaintiff's table with 3 attorneys in expensive suits, and when I walked in, he did not look at me. Serena sat in the gallery wearing black, her face composed into careful neutrality, and I noticed that she had not brought Cecilia Voss with her. Judge Raymond Holt entered, 65 years old, silver-haired, reading glasses on a chain. He surveyed the room with the expression of a man who had seen every possible variation of human disappointment and had long since stopped being surprised by any of it. Marshall's lead attorney, a man named Graydon, presented their case with the polished fluency of someone who had made this argument many times before in many forms. Mrs. Price showed signs of cognitive decline. Mrs. Price had become convinced without basis that her son had mismanaged her late husband's estate. Mrs. Price had taken erratic and hostile action against her own family, locking them from their home and refusing rational discussion. Holt listened. His expression gave nothing away. Owen stood and said concisely and without drama that his client had not experienced cognitive decline, that she had been the victim of systematic fraud on a significant scale, that the only person in the room with cause to fear an investigation was Marshall Price, and that the petition before the court was not an act of filial concern, but an attempt by an accused party to silence his accuser by having her declared legally incompetent. He opened his briefcase and placed a folder on the table. "I have documentation here, Your Honor, establishing that Marshall Price forged his mother's signature on amended trust documents, illegally transferred $42 million in stock holdings into his own name, and has been drawing from her estate for 9 years without her knowledge or consent." The room fractured. Marshall's face went several colors in rapid succession. Graydon was on his feet with objections. Holt brought his gavel down once hard, and the noise stopped. He looked at the folder. He looked at Owen. He looked at Graydon. "Mr. Graydon," he said slowly, "were you aware of these allegations when you filed this petition?" "Your Honor, these are fabrications designed to—" "Were you aware?" Graydon's jaw tightened. "We were aware Mrs. Price had made certain accusations. We believe they are symptomatic of the cognitive deterioration we have described, and the evidence of this deterioration. We have an affidavit from Mr. Price himself, documenting years of concerning behavior, and statements from Mrs. Price's daughter-in-law and from members of their social circle." I was on my feet before I had decided to stand. "What household staff?" My voice was steady, and it was loud enough that every head in the room turned. Holt looked at me over his reading glasses. "There is no household staff, Your Honor," I said. "I was the household staff. For 15 years I cooked their meals and cleaned their house and served their guests, and they told anyone who asked that they were taking care of me." I paused. "I am not confused about what happened to me. I am not paranoid about my son's behavior. I am the primary beneficiary of my husband's estate. I am the legal owner of my home, and the man who stole both of those things from me is sitting at that table." Graydon said something about emotional instability. I did not look at him. Holt was quiet for a long moment. Then he looked at Owen. "Mr. Bassett, I'm going to need to see this documentation, all of it. We have a complete psychological evaluation from Dr. Constance Morrow, conducted 3 days ago, establishing that Mrs. Price is fully competent and shows no signs of cognitive impairment. We have the original trust documents, the forged amendments, and a side-by-side signature analysis. Owen paused. We are also prepared to file a counter-petition today, Your Honor, seeking criminal charges for elder financial abuse, fraud, and forgery. The word criminal opened something in the room. Holt removed his reading glasses. The petition for guardianship is denied, he said. Mrs. Price retains full authority over her person and her property. He turned to Marshall's table, and something in his expression had shifted, some warmth replaced by something harder. Mr. Price, you are ordered to provide a complete accounting of all estate assets, trust distributions, and financial transactions related to your late father's holdings within 30 days. Failure to comply will be treated as contempt. He reached for his gavel. I am also issuing a restraining order. You are not to contact your mother or approach within 500 feet of her residence. Pending the outcome of the investigation, the court is hereby ordering. Marshall's mouth opened and closed. Graydon was speaking rapidly in his ear. Mr. Price, Holt said, I asked whether you understood. Yes, Marshall said. His voice was barely audible. Yes, Your Honor. The gavel came down. I stood in that courtroom while the room emptied around me, and Owen turned to me with something that was almost a smile, and I felt not triumph, but something quieter and more durable, the specific solidity of a person standing on ground that is finally actually theirs. Outside, the photographers were waiting. The story had leaked, and the questions came fast and overlapping, and I answered them, looking directly into the cameras with my hands completely still at my sides. My son took $68 million. He forged my name. He spent 9 years treating me like a servant in my own house while living on money that was legally mine. When I discovered the truth, he tried to have me declared incompetent to preserve his control. I am pursuing full accountability because fraud does not become acceptable because the person who committed it is family. In the car afterward, Owen was quiet for a long time. Then he said, That went better than I expected. The hearing, yes, I said, but you told me Holt was conservative. He surprised me. Owen nodded slowly. He surprised me too, but I think what surprised him more was Marshall. He paused. When a judge who was inclined to believe you realizes he was being used, he tends to overcorrect. He turned onto the highway. We won today, but Mrs. Price, in 30 days, when that accounting comes in, we are going to find out exactly how much there is to fight for, and I suspect it is considerably more than 42 million. I watched the city move past the window. How much more? I asked. I don't know yet, Owen said, but I want you to prepare yourself, because whatever we find, it is going to be worse than what you already know. The call came at midnight. I was lying in the master bedroom, in the bed that was mine again, still too wired to sleep, when my phone lit up with an unknown number. I answered it because I had learned in the past week that the calls worth taking were often the ones from numbers I did not recognize. Breathing first, then Serena's voice, stripped of every social grace it had ever employed, low and stripped down to something raw and furious. You think you've won something, she said. You've destroyed your own son. When this is over, when Marshall goes to prison because of what you've done, You will have no one. You'll die alone in that house counting your money, and there won't be a single person who cares. I held the phone. I thought about all the dinners, about all the years of service entrance and silk blouses and almond milk and good slacks that apparently weren't good enough to be seen in. If I'm no one, I said, why are you calling me at midnight? Silence. Don't contact me again, I said and ended the call. My hands were shaking when I set the phone down, but it was not the shaking of fear. It was adrenaline, the specific electric charge of a person who has just for the second time in their life discovered what they are actually capable of. The 30 days ahead of me were not going to be quiet. Owen had told me that. Marshall would push back on every front, and the accounting that came in would reveal things I was not yet prepared to know, and the media would have opinions about all of it, and some of those opinions would call me vindictive and unforgiving and worse. But lying there in the dark in my house in my bed, with Serena's threat still fading from the air around me, I thought about Harold, about what he had built and why he had built it, about the 35 years he had gone to that office and done the work and brought it home to us in the form of security and future. I had not built it for Marshall to spend on a beach house in the Hamptons. I had built it for me. And in 30 days, when the accounting arrived and Owen called me with news that was going to require me to sit down, I was going to be ready for whatever it said. On day 5 of living alone in the house, I woke before sunrise and lay still in the dark listening to it breathe around me. A house has sounds when it is yours and sounds when it is not, and I was only beginning to relearn the difference. Every creak of settling wood, every groan of the old pipes, every particular silence between gusts of November wind had belonged to me once, and then had been taken and was now being returned incrementally in the way that things taken slowly can only be given back slowly. I was patient. I had learned patience the hard way, and now I was finding that the skill transferred. Owen called at 8 that morning with the accounting. I need you to sit down, he said, which was how I knew it was worse than 42 million. I was already sitting at the kitchen table with coffee, looking at the overgrown garden through the window. Harold had helped me plant that garden the spring after we moved in a Saturday in April when Marshall was still an infant in a carrier strapped to my chest, and now the beds were crowded with things that had seeded themselves without permission and choked out what I had originally chosen. I had not had time to tend it in years. There had always been something more urgent, something more immediately demanded. Tell me, I said. The stock holdings were only the beginning. Harold's estate, fully inventoried, had totaled $68 million. Beyond the Whitmore Industries shares, there had been real estate investments, municipal bonds, treasury notes, and a $3 million life insurance policy that had been designated to pay out directly to me. In the 9 years since Harold died, Marshall had moved through approximately 43 million of it. The details came in waves, each one larger than the last. A vacation property in the Hamptons in Marshall's name, multiple vehicles, Serena's expenditures on clothing, travel, and renovation running into the hundreds of thousands, private school tuition for a nephew I had not known existed, the child of a friend Marshall had apparently decided deserved his mother's money more than his mother did. And then the offshore transfers. 47 of them spread across 12 years, moving money in amounts calculated to avoid triggering automatic scrutiny flowing into accounts in the Cayman Islands and Switzerland. Combined, they totaled just under $20 million. Can we recover it? I asked. Owen was quiet for a moment, in the way of someone measuring what hope is responsible to offer. Some, perhaps half. The rest is either spent or buried deep enough that tracing it will take years and may never be complete. He paused. But the house is definitively yours, and the remaining Whitmore shares, approximately $25 million worth, are untouched. Combined with what we can recover, you will not be poor, Dorothea. You will be more than comfortable for the rest of your life. I thought about the rest of my life. I was 72 years old, and for 9 of those years I had been scrubbing floors and serving dinners and sleeping in a small room under a slanted ceiling, while my son spent my money on beach houses and offshore accounts. The math of what remained of my time felt different than it had a week ago, not shorter, differently shaped. When is the next hearing? I asked. Monday, Owen said. And Dorothea, the media has found this story. Someone leaked it. There will be cameras outside the courthouse. I want you to be prepared for that. I've been invisible for 15 years, I said. I think I can manage being seen. That night, I did something I had not done since the week Harold died. I filled the master bath, the deep soaking tub that had been Serena's renovation and now was simply mine again, and I sat in water hot enough to turn my skin pink, and I let myself cry in the way I had not allowed myself to cry in public, not at the courthouse, not on the phone with Owen, not when I had stood at the window watching Marshall and Serena load their bags into the car and drive away. The sounds I made echoed off the tile, and I did not try to muffle them. I cried for Harold, who had trusted his son and had not lived to see what that trust produced. I cried for the relationship with Marshall that had died slowly over 15 years before I had understood it was dying. I cried for the grandmother I had never become, because Marshall and Serena had decided children were too much disruption to a life built around acquisitions. I cried for the woman I had been before grief and manipulation and years of systematic diminishment had reduced her to someone who thanked people for the privilege of washing their laundry. When the water went cold and the crying stopped, I climbed out and dried off and stood at the mirror and looked at myself for a long time. Old. There was no useful purpose in pretending otherwise. My hair was silver, and my face was lined, and my hands showed every year of the work they had done, but my eyes were clear in a way I had not seen them in a long time, and the woman looking back at me from the glass was not diminished. She was distilled. Everything unnecessary had been burned away, and what remained was the part that had always refused, even at its smallest, to completely disappear. I went to bed and slept 8 hours without waking. The courthouse Monday morning was surrounded by news vans. Owen had warned me, but the reality of it still required a moment of adjustment. The cameras and the reporters and the low, steady hum of public attention that I had spent my entire life avoiding. I walked through it looking straight ahead and feeling strangely less exposed than I had felt at Serena's dinner party, carrying soup through a room full of women who looked through me. At least here they could see me. At least here I existed. The courtroom was packed. Nora Price was there sitting in the gallery on my side of the room, and when I came in, she stood and gave me a look that contained more than a look usually holds. She had driven 4 hours from where she lived now. She had called me 3 times in the preceding week, and each conversation had given me something I had not realized. I was missing the perspective of someone who had known Harold, who had known Marshall before all of this, who could confirm for me that my memory of our family as it had once been was not an invention of grief. Marshall arrived with 2 attorneys instead of 3. He looked like a man who had not slept in a week, which I suspected was accurate. His suit was pressed, but his eyes were not, and he sat at the plaintiff's table with his shoulders arranged into a posture of confidence that cost him visible effort to maintain. Serena was not there. I noticed it immediately and said nothing about it. Her absence told me something about her read of the situation, about what she had concluded in the days since the last hearing. Serena had always been precise about where to position herself in relation to outcomes. She would not be present for one she had calculated would go badly. Judge Holt entered, and the room rose and sat. He looked at the packed gallery without expression, then opened the financial accounting Marshall's legal team had submitted 2 days before the deadline. He read in silence for what felt like a very long time. Then he looked up. Mr. Graydon, the $3 million life insurance policy. Where is it? Graydon stood. Applied to estate taxes and legal fees, Your Honor. Estate taxes on a trust structure do not work that way. Try again. A pause. Graydon glanced at Marshall. I would need to consult with my client before providing further detail. Your client is present, Holt said. Mr. Price, the insurance money. Marshall stood slowly. Something had changed in him since the last hearing. Some layer of performance had worn through, and what showed underneath was a man who was very tired of carrying something very heavy. Some of it covered estate administration costs. The rest was invested in accounts bearing your name or your mother's. Mine. So you took $3 million designated for your mother and invested it for yourself. I was managing her assets without her knowledge or her consent. Holt's voice was not raised. It was worse than raised. It was very quiet and very certain. That is not asset management, Mr. Price. That is conversion. He turned several pages of the accounting. And these offshore transfers, 47 transactions across 12 years, totaling approximately $20 million. Explain them. Graydon started to speak. Holt stopped him with one raised finger, still looking at Marshall. Your client, he said. Marshall was quiet for a long moment. In the gallery, Nora had her hands pressed flat on her thighs. Owen beside me was completely still. Business expenses, Marshall said. Legitimate international transactions related to managing the estate's holdings. $20 million in business expenses routed to the Cayman Islands and Switzerland over 12 years. Holt removed his reading glasses entirely and set them on the desk. Mr. Price, I'm going to ask you one time to explain to this court where your mother's money went. The courtroom held its breath. Marshall looked at his attorney. His attorney looked at the table. I spent it, Marshall said. The gallery erupted. Holt's gavel came down twice, and the noise reduced to a charged, pressurized silence. You spent it, Holt repeated, on living expenses, on the house renovations, on Serena. He stopped. He looked like a man watching a structure he built collapse in slow motion, knowing it was too late to do anything but watch. She wanted things. She said we deserved to live well, that my father would have wanted us to have a good life, the renovations, the cars, the travel. I kept telling myself that eventually it would all come to me anyway. He paused. When my mother passed, I thought I was just accessing it early. The silence that followed was the completest silence I had ever heard in a room full of people. When my mother passed, I had planned around my death. He had looked at his mother, at a woman of 63 who had just lost her husband and signed papers she was too broken to read, and he had decided that the money was effectively his already because she would not live long enough to matter. He had spent 9 years of my life operating on that calculation. I did not make a sound. I sat with my hands folded in my lap, and I looked at my son, and I saw him clearly, perhaps for the first time in years, not the successful businessman and not the devoted son he had performed for Serena's charity dinners, and not the stranger who had stood in Harold's study in the dark and told me my name was on nothing. Just a man who had made a terrible choice at the worst possible moment and had spent 9 years building a life on top of it and had run out of road. Holt leaned forward. Mr. Price, do you understand what you have just admitted to in open court? Marshall seemed to register for the first time the full weight of the room around him. His face went the color of old paper. I need to speak with my attorney, he said. You have been speaking with your attorney for 2 hearings, Holt said. Based on your statement before this court and the documentation Mr. Bassett has provided, I am finding probable cause for criminal fraud and embezzlement charges. Bailiff. The room came apart at the seams. Graydon was on his feet. Reporters in the gallery were writing with both hands. Nora made a sound that was not quite a word, and I sat still and watched as a bailiff approached my son and asked him quietly to stand. Marshall looked at me as they put the handcuffs on. He looked at me the way you look at someone from a very great distance, from across something that cannot be crossed, and his face held all the things there were no longer words for. Mom, he said. Just that. Just the word like the first word he had ever learned. I did not look away. I did not soften. I had softened for 15 years, and I knew now where it led. You should have thought of that, I said, before you spent her money. They led him out past the gallery, past Nora, who was crying quietly into her hands, past the reporters who were writing everything down. Graydon was speaking rapidly to someone on his phone. Serena was not there to see it, and I noted that absence the way you note a piece of a puzzle that was never going to fit anyway. Outside, the cameras closed in immediately. Owen was at my elbow, but I put my hand on his arm and stopped walking. I turned to face the microphones. My son took $68 million that my husband worked 35 years to build for our family, I said. He forged my name. He filed false documents with the court. He spent 9 years treating me as a servant in my own house while living on money that was legally mine. When I discovered the truth, he petitioned to have me declared incompetent because he believed that destroying my legal standing was preferable to returning what he had stolen. I paused. I am pursuing full accountability because what he did was fraud, and fraud does not become acceptable because the person who committed it shares your last name. A reporter called out, "But he's your son. Doesn't that change anything? The boy I raised would not have done this, I said. The man who did this made his own choices. I can grieve one and hold the other accountable at the same time. Owen steered me to the car then, and we drove in silence until we were clear of the cameras, and I sat with my hands in my lap and watched Boston move past the windows and felt something I had not expected to feel. Not triumph, something quieter than triumph. The particular stillness of a long-held breath, finally completely released. Serena came to my door that night. I had been expecting it, and I had decided in advance that I would open the door. She stood on my porch in the black dress from the courthouse that she had apparently not changed out of her face, showing something I had never seen on it in 15 years, the specific disarray of a person whose whole construction has come apart at once. She had always been immaculate. Even in anger, she had been polished. This was different. You put him in jail, she said. He put himself in jail. I was building a life. Everything we had, we built together. With my money, I said, on my property, using my husband's name. He loved me. Her voice cracked on it. Whatever else he did, he loved me. I looked at her and thought about Serena at the head of the dining room table, radiant in cream silk, accepting compliments on the house she had not built and the food she had not cooked and the career she had not earned. I thought about 15 years of small cruelties delivered with a smile. I thought about a midnight phone call and the word dear and a petition to have me declared legally incompetent. Serena, I said the day Marshall was sentenced, you filed for divorce. She did not deny it. Whatever he felt for you, you knew what you were doing the whole time, I said. Every renovation, every car, every dinner party where I served the food and you took the credit, you knew exactly where the money came from. So please don't stand on my porch and tell me about love. She raised her hand. I watched her do it, and I did not move. I had stopped flinching a long time ago. She lowered it. Something went out of her eyes that had been there for 15 years. The absolute certainty that I was beneath her, that I would absorb whatever she offered and apologize for finding it insufficient. Get off my property, I said, and I closed the door. I stood in the hallway and listened to her heels on the porch steps, and then the sound of her car, and then nothing, and the nothing was fine. Marshall took a plea agreement 3 weeks later, 7 years with the possibility of parole after 4. The headline in the Globe read, "Son admits to defrauding elderly mother of decades-long inheritance." I read it once and set the newspaper on the kitchen table and made myself a second cup of coffee and sat in the morning light and felt primarily tired. The letter came 10 days after that. Marshall's handwriting on the envelope forwarded through his attorney. I sat with it unopened for a long time before I finally tore the seal. He wrote for 2 pages, and the handwriting got unsteadier as it went. He did not ask for forgiveness. He was explicit about that, repeated it as though he knew I needed to hear it more than once. He said he knew when it had started, the exact moment after Harold died, when he had understood that he could take everything and had decided that taking it was justified. He said once it started, it had been easy to continue, and he was not offering that as an excuse, but as a confession of how a person becomes someone they would not have recognized 10 years earlier. Serena filed the day I was sentenced, he wrote. I am not telling you this for sympathy. I am telling you because you were right about her. She loved what I could provide. I loved her more than I loved you, and I chose her over you every single time it came to a choice, and that is the thing I cannot forgive in myself. Not the money, not the fraud. The fact that I looked at my mother and decided she was less important than my wife's opinion of our kitchen renovation. He signed it, Marshall, not Love Marshall, just Marshall, which was somehow more honest than any declaration of feeling would have been. I read it 3 times. Then I folded it carefully and put it in the back of the drawer in my nightstand behind a photograph of Harold and me on our honeymoon, young and broke and completely certain of each other. I did not respond, not because I had nothing to say, but because I needed time to understand what I actually felt, and that understanding was going to take longer than a letter. That night I cooked dinner, not out of obligation, not for an audience, not because someone's schedule required it. I roasted a chicken with root vegetables and made mashed potatoes from scratch, and set the table with the good china, and lit 2 candles, and poured a glass of wine from a bottle Harold had been saving for a particular occasion that never arrived, and I sat alone in the dining room where I had served 100 of Serena's dinners, and I ate slowly and tasted everything. It should have felt lonely. What it felt like was reclamation. Nora called that weekend. She had been calling every few days, and each call was different from the one before, as we found our way back to a relationship that Marshall had methodically dismantled over years of small interventions. She told me she had told her daughters about their grandmother, the real version, not the story Marshall had maintained. Her older daughter, who was 9, wanted to know if I would teach her to paint. I said I would try, though I was not much of a painter myself. 3 weeks after the sentencing, a woman appeared at my door on a gray Tuesday morning. She was perhaps my age, with silver hair pulled back in a ponytail and a sweater that had seen considerable use, and she was smiling in the way of someone who is not sure of their welcome but has decided to show up anyway. Agatha Lennox, from the book club. I had not seen her in 16 years. I saw you on the news, she said, and I thought you might need a friend. I started crying before she finished the sentence. She stepped inside and put her arms around me, and I cried into her shoulder without trying to explain or apologize or manage it, and she held on without saying anything, which was exactly right. We sat in the living room for 3 hours that morning. I told her everything. She listened without interrupting, her hand on mine, and when I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "What are you going to do now?" she asked. "I don't know," I said. "For 15 years I had no choices. Now I have too many and I can't seem to move." "Then start small," Agatha said. "What did you used to love before Harold died, before all of this? What made you feel like yourself?" I had to actually think about it, which told me something about how long it had been. "I used to paint," I said finally. "Watercolors. I was never good at it, but I loved it." She stood up and held out her hand. "Come on, get your coat." We spent the afternoon in an art supply store that smelled like possibility, and I bought brushes and paper and paint in colors that had no practical application, and no one was going to tell me I did not need. Agatha brought me back to the book club the following Thursday. Walking into that coffee shop felt like stepping through a gap in time. The same mismatched chairs, the same smell of dark roast and cinnamon, the same low hum of women talking about things that mattered to them. Some faces I recognized, some were new. Phyllis Drummond, who had been in the club since before I joined, stood up when she saw me and crossed the room and put both arms around me, and the rest of the women followed, and no one mentioned the trial or the newspapers or anything about Marshall, and I understood that I had been missed in a way that 15 years of isolation had made it impossible for me to know. Owen called 6 months later with the final recovery numbers, 32 million free and clear, with more potentially retrievable from the offshore accounts as proceedings continued. Combined with the remaining Whitmore Industries shares, I would not have to worry about money for the rest of my life or for several lives after that. I hired a financial advisor Owen recommended and set up a new trust, conservatively managed, and then I did what I had been thinking about since the morning I sat at the kitchen table reading Marshall's list of supposed evidence of my incompetence. I established a fund in Harold's name, providing free legal representation and advocacy services to elderly people experiencing financial exploitation by family members. Because I had been able to afford Owen Bassett, most people could not. The first year, the fund helped 43 people. By the end of the third year, it was more than 200. I did not publicize my involvement. That was not the point. I attended my first Whitmore Industries board meeting on a Thursday in March. I sat at the long conference table in the seat that had been Harold's for 35 years, and I felt his presence in the room the way you feel the presence of someone deeply known, not as grief, but as continuity. The CEO welcomed me with the polished warmth of a man managing expectations. I told him I had reviewed the quarterly reports and had questions about supplier practices and the employee profit-sharing program that had been cut 3 times in 5 years, while executive compensation increased. Several men exchanged looks. One of them, older than the rest, laughed. "Harold always said you were the smart one," he said. Looks like he was right. The meeting was different after that. 2 years after the hearing, I sold the house. It was not a quick decision or a simple one. That house held 40 years of things that mattered, built up in layers like sediment, and I spent several weeks walking through it, trying to understand which parts of it were mine and which parts had been contaminated by what happened there. The answer finally was that the house itself was not the problem. The problem was that every room held 2 versions of itself simultaneously, the version from before and the version from after, and I was tired of living in the overlap. I found a condo downtown with large windows and no history, high ceilings light from 3 directions a building that had no opinion about who I had been or who I was supposed to become. I painted the walls myself in colors chosen for no reason other than that I liked them. I hung my own watercolors on every available surface. The paintings I had been making for 2 years now, in Agatha's kitchen and in the garden and in the art class at the community center, where I had met, among others, a widower named Wendell Fisk, who was 78 years old and painted as badly as I did, and thought this was entirely beside the point. Wendell had lost his wife 5 years earlier. He was gentle and unhurried and asked questions about me that assumed I had a self-worth asking about, which after 15 years of invisibility was a form of attention I had almost forgotten how to receive. He asked me to coffee. I almost said no. I was 76 years old, with silver hair and a son in prison, and enough history to fill several lifetimes, and I could not think of a single reason why any of that should be a barrier to sitting across a table from a kind man and seeing what happened. We went to the Vietnamese restaurant Agatha had taken me to on the afternoon she brought me back to the world. We talked for 3 hours. He did not mention the trial, did not ask about Marshall, did not treat me as a story he had read somewhere and wanted to understand. He asked what I was reading. He asked which of my watercolors I was most proud of. He asked what I wanted to do with the next part of my life, as though the next part of my life were an open question rather than a diminishing one. I told him I wanted to keep painting. I wanted to keep working with the foundation. I wanted to travel somewhere. Harold and I had always meant to go and never had. I wanted to learn whether the garden at the condo building could be coaxed into producing anything, and if not, I wanted to find out what could be coaxed instead. Wendell listened to all of it with the particular quality of attention that means a person is actually hearing you. I would like to see you again, he said when the check came. So would I said. 5 years after Marshall's arrest, on an ordinary Tuesday morning in March, my doorbell rang. I opened the door and he was standing on the small landing outside my condo, older than I remembered, thinner, with lines in his face that prison and something else had put there. He was out on parole. I had been notified. I had known this moment was coming, and I had not decided in advance what I was going to do when it arrived. He looked at me for a long time without speaking. Then he said, "I know I'm not supposed to initiate contact. I know you didn't ask for this, but I needed to say this in person. I needed you to hear it from me directly, not in a letter." "Say it," I said. "I'm sorry. I know I've said it before. I know it doesn't repair anything, but I need you to understand that I see it now, all of it, not just what I took, but what it cost you. Your dignity, your sense of yourself, the years you spent becoming invisible in your own home." He paused. "And I need you to know that the foundation, the work you've done, the people it's helped, that's the best thing that came from any part of my life. The best thing I produced was the circumstances that made you decide to fight back." I stood in my doorway and looked at my son, at the stranger he had become, and the familiar shape of the man underneath the stranger, and I felt something that had no clean name, not forgiveness, not its absence, but something more complicated than either. "I'm dying," he said. "Pancreatic cancer. 6 months, maybe less." He tried to smile, and it did not quite arrive. "Karma, right." "Marshall," I said. "I'm not here for anything," he said quickly. "I have hospice care. I have what I need. I just needed to look you in the eye." He took a breath. "I love you, Mom. I know I showed it in the worst possible way for a very long time, but I love you." He turned and walked to the elevator at the end of the hallway. I stood in the doorway and watched him go, and the feeling in my chest was enormous and had no simple outlet, and I let it be what it was without trying to resolve it into something cleaner. I did not go to him in hospice. I wanted to. Part of me wanted very much to go to sit beside him, to say whatever could still be said before it was too late. But forgiveness is not something you owe a person because they are dying. Forgiveness is something that arrives when it arrives, if it arrives, and I was not going to perform it because the calendar demanded it. Marshall died on a Wednesday in June. The hospice called me. He had been alone at the end. I sat with that information for a long time. Then I called Wendell, and he came over, and we sat on the small balcony of my condo and watched the evening settle over the city and did not say very much because there was not very much to say, that the quiet could not hold better. The next morning I painted. Not Marshall, not the house, not any of the grief or the anger or the 15 years of invisible labor that had preceded everything else. I painted the sunrise I could see from the balcony, the particular way the light came up over the buildings to the east, pink shading into gold and then into a clear pale blue that seemed to hold more possibility than a single morning could reasonably contain. It was the best thing I had ever made. Agatha said so. Wendell said so. I said so myself, looking at it afterward, and felt no impulse to qualify the claim. Now, at 79, I sit in my condo on Thursday mornings with coffee and the particular pleasure of a life that belongs to me. Wendell is here most days. Nora calls every week. The book club is reading something none of us expected to like, and all of us do. The foundation has helped more than 300 people. I am still learning to paint, which is to say, I am still learning, which is to say, I am not done. I think about Marshall sometimes, about who he was when he was small and who he became, and the distance between those two people, which is a distance I have stopped trying to measure because the measurement does not produce anything useful. I think about Harold more, and with more warmth and with fewer of the complicated feelings that shadowed the early years after his death. He was a good man who trusted the wrong person with the wrong thing. He could not have known. I have made my peace with that. Here is what I know now that I did not know at 63, standing in a fog of grief and signing papers I did not read. Your family does not get a pass for destroying you simply because they share your history. Love is not demonstrated by endurance, and the most courageous thing a person can do sometimes is to look at what has been taken and decide that the taking is not the end of the story. I stayed invisible for 15 years, and then I stopped. And every morning I wake up in my own space, make my own coffee, look at my own paintings on my own walls, and think about what I want to do with the hours ahead of me is a victory of a kind that no court and no accounting and no amount of recovered money could have given me on its own. Not a victory over Marshall, over the woman I had been, the one who had believed for far too long that invisible was all she deserved to be. Wendell comes in from the kitchen with his own coffee and sits beside me, and we look out at the city together. Two people who survived their own separate losses and found unexpectedly that surviving left room for something more. What are you thinking about? He asks. Harold, I say, and how far I've come from where he left me. Wendell is quiet for a moment. Then he says he would have liked to see this. Yes, I say, he would have. We sit together as the morning opens up ahead of us, and in the space where so much anger once lived, I feel something that I have learned not to question or qualify or hold too tightly for fear of losing it, something that has taken years to grow in soil that was not always hospitable, something small and sturdy and entirely mine. It is enough. After everything, it is more than enough. It is everything.